Happy Wednesday, everybody, and welcome back to our YouTube channel here. Recently, we have been talking about the life of King David and how he was different from King Saul in that everything that he did before he was king and when he started his reign as king, he honestly wanted to honor God. One of the first things he did was he sought the right way to bring the ark back into Jerusalem, so that way the people could have a place to worship the presence of God, because that's what was the Ark of the Covenant was. It was the presence of God. And so we talked about that a little bit. But then when we last left off, King David made a mistake. And I say that very lightly because it was a pretty big mistake to actually make in this story, especially since King David was known after a man after God's own heart and honestly sought to do what was right in the eyes of God. But then he made this huge mistake where he slept with a woman that was not his wife. He got her pregnant and then had her husband killed so that way nobody would find out that it was supposed to be David's. But God knew. And so where we pick up today, God is going to deal with King David and what he had done wrong. So we're talking in 2 Samuel chapter 12 today. So it was just after the time that Bathsheba had gotten pregnant, and that after a while that she had actually given birth to the baby. And the prophet Nathan shows up to David, and what he does is he kind of makes it like a parable type riddle type thing of what would you do in this situation. And so Nathan comes to King David and says, so there were two men in a town. One was super rich, the other was super poor. The rich man had a lot of sheep and cattle, and the poor man had nothing except one little lamb that he had brought, and he loved this little lamb. But a traveler came to the rich man and asked for, a dinner. And the rich man, instead of giving him one of his own many sheep and cows, decided to steal from the poor man and then kill that lamb so they could have dinner together. And Nathan kind of is like, so what are you going to do about this? And David gets angry. He's like, oh, as surely as God lives, the man who had stolen that one sheep from that man should die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity about it. And Nathan stands there and goes, you are that man. This is what God, the God of Israel, says to you. I anointed you king over Israel. I delivered you from Saul. I gave you everything. I established your house. And if that hadn't been enough, I would have given you more. So why did you do what was wrong in the eyes of the Lord? Why did you kill a man and take his wife when you had enough of your own? And so, because of what you've done, I'm going to bring calamity on you. And as he's going through all of this, David realizes what he had done, and he says, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan replies back to him, yep, but God has taken away your sin, and you are not going to die for your sin. But because of what you did, and you showed contempt against the Lord, the son that you had with Bathsheba is going to die. And so throughout this whole thing, David had 2 responses. Because remember, when King Saul was confronted with his sin, King Saul tried to blame, he tried to excuse it, he tried to justify it, instead of actually owning it. But David here is different from King Saul in that he actually owns it. He says, yeah, I absolutely did that. I sinned against God, and I should die for this. And so we already see a huge contrast between King Saul and King David, because both sinned because they weren't perfect, because only God is perfect. But King David's response to what God had said is completely different than what Saul's response was. And so the end of this story is that the child got sick and after a course of time died. But then later on, after him and Bathsheba had gotten married, they ended up having another kid whose name was Solomon. And we'll be talking more about Solomon, so that name is important to remember because we'll talk more about him later on. But the important thing to remember is it doesn't matter if you mess up, because you are definitely going to mess up in your life. The most important thing to remember is that how you respond when somebody tells you that you did something wrong, it matters. It matters if you own up to it. It matters if you try to hide from it. And it matters how you choose to live your life after that. And so even though you're going to mess up, own it. Own it. Ask for forgiveness from God. Ask for forgiveness from people around you who you may have hurt in that way because of what you did. Instead of trying to hide from it and trying to run away from it. Because even though it says here that God is going to bring calamity along David's household, he doesn't say anything about that he's going to rip the kingship from David's family the way he did with King Saul. Because you'll remember that none of King Saul's sons were going to be king because of what God had said. And so we have a different story here because of David's response. And so it's important for us to remember that when we are confronted with our sin, we don't run from it. Instead, we run to God and we recognize what we did and we ask for forgiveness. And so what happens next, we'll talk about on Saturday, but David's actions have started a course in his family that's going to take a long time to get away from. And so we'll kind of talk about something else that happens in his family on Saturday. So we'll see you then.